Yet again, birth rates this year have fallen, and the press declares that it's down 14% since 1960, and we're falling at a rate that will take us below replacement in only a few years. How will we fix this problem? Okay, but why is it a problem? And why is it happening? The panic over the birth rate falling is not a novel thing. And I'm not just talking about 1970s birth control and divorce fears. It basically goes back as far as we've really bothered to keep numbers on this sort of thing. And the crazier part is that both the arguments for and against an increase in births haven't changed. Today, it's mostly brought up in reference to aging populations and the burden that creates on our government and economy. Things like Social Security relying on a large working population to support the retired one, or just smaller communities or even states that have an older skewing population that needs a younger one to continue to keep the infrastructure going. But we built that entire system as the baby boom generation was moving into an adulthood. It really couldn't be tenable to continue at that rate, right? So why don't we just adjust the system? That seems easier than asking thousands of people to have more children every year, especially asking people who can't afford them to have more. But if Social Security and retirement communities are relatively new, why were they panicking about birth rates 50 or 100 years ago? Well, it turns out that may be the real answer to today's panic as well. First, a little bit of basics. Birth rate can be measured by births per woman, births per 1,000 women, or against death rate. Death rate is obviously only essential when we're looking at replacement theories, and also can vary a lot more when things like COVID happen and death rate goes way up. Not the most reliable or useful in terms of our own actual experiences. It will take decades for that to really matter. Per 1,000 women is good for a broad, say, nationwide average to know how it's affecting society as a whole, how many new schools or teachers or pediatricians are going to be essential in the coming years. This is usually presented in percentages, which I feel like kind of obscures the actual experience of this. Down 5% doesn't really mean anything tangible. The best I've found for making it approachable is children per woman. I'm not saying family because those can change with divorce and marriage and the like, and that gets confusing, but this is a visible difference, both in how large most of the families we know today are, but in looking at our ancestry and seeing how many siblings our great grandparents actually had. So, we're going to start there. But first, I want to take a moment on our own medical history with the sponsor for today's video, ZocDoc. Every time I move, every time I hit another age milestone, every time I have a rough health day, I realize just how much I keep putting off finding the right doctor. But that means searching through name after name, digging up reviews, figuring out who takes my insurance, and all to find months-long waiting lists if they're even taking new patients. It's just another thing to add to the list until suddenly I have health issues that can't wait that long. That's where ZocDoc comes in. They'll let you easily search through 150,000 providers who are local and in network, which includes more than 200 specialties, from dentists to primary care to psychiatrists. The reviews are right there so you can find an option that works for your needs. And even better, they show you a list of available appointments and you can instantly book. No phone calls, no leaving voicemails and hoping for a response. Just a straightforward system that lays everything out, and that means you can prioritize based on what you need right now. And it's free to use. I know so many of you are in this exact predicament, putting it off because you're busy, stressed, or don't even know where to start. I've absolutely been there. And we both know we shouldn't keep waiting until something goes wrong before we finally deal with it. You deserve to have someone in your corner before the crisis hits. With ZocDoc, you can book your appointment and see a doctor fast, usually within 24 to 72 hours, sometimes even the same day. Taking care of your health just got easier. Head to ZocDoc.com/Nicole Rudolph to get started and check that appointment off your to-do list. Thank you to ZocDoc for sponsoring today's video and for helping us all take better care of our health. In the 20th century, the average children per woman was generally in the range of 2 to 4. The only section above 3 is the post-World War II baby boom from around 1946 to 65. After that, it mostly hovers at or below 2. It's not a huge difference between 1.75 and 2 when you really think about it. It's especially small compared to when we start to zoom out further. In 1800, the US had one of the highest global birth rates of around 8 children per woman. If we go to other areas that allow us to trace back further, England and Wales hovered around 5 to 6 range before sliding down to just below 2. Presumably, these are counting live births that lived at least long enough to be recorded. We obviously record every birth now, but unless the infant lived long enough to be counted in some sort of statistic like a church record for a baptism or a census record, that wasn't always the case. And that really wasn't changed until well into the 20th century. This drop of around half was understandably stark and noticeable, at least in statistics. As of the 1870s, articles began popping up calling out the change in census records. The true panic didn't really set in until the 1890s, however. By that time, France was also seeing intense changes in numbers, and that was not only unsettling to the French government, but to all Eurocentric countries. In response, France made any families with 3 or more children exempt from taxation, giving that burden over to those with less than 3. It didn't fix the issue, at least not immediately. In American media, they not only compared the dropping birth rates here to the French panic, but the downfall of Greece and Rome, because apparently that birth rate heralds the end of an empire. America was growing quickly, but that just made it vulnerable in the eyes of the powerful. The concept of manifest destiny was created in 1845 and used as reasoning to not only annex more land, but to fill it with as many people as possible. Well, the right people. The truth of the matter was that the American population was growing rapidly. It was just through immigration in the late 19th century instead of a population born here, which presented a completely different problem than just the one of birth rate. It's at this time that the first anti-immigration bill was passed, limiting the Chinese population in 1882. Southern and Eastern European numbers were growing as well, and they were not actually lumped in with the native-born white population. As I mentioned in my last video about the 8-hour day, even the German immigrants in Chicago were not easily welcomed. They were still outsiders. The Immigration Restriction League, founded in 1894 by some very rich and powerful people in Boston, eventually spread to other cities, lobbied the government over the next few decades and was a big part of the 1917 immigration bill. They argued for opening up Northern European numbers while reducing Southern ones, as well as generally higher fees and literacy tests. As immigration numbers peaked, so did the fear and resistance. This was the era of evolution, genetics, and eugenics. Science may have been progressing, but that didn't stop it from being wielded like a weapon in social issues. After all, those who were writing about those topics grew up in the time when slavery had only just ended, colonialism was still in its peak, and the removal of indigenous peoples was a standard part of manifest destiny, much to the benefit of those who had the respected voices within the scientific and medical communities. Explaining why these social standards and practices were supported by logic and reason seemed pretty important to those who had both social and financial benefit in a steep class system based on race. With all of the tension around immigrants in comparison to the older American families becoming the cultural minority, the term race suicide was coined and quickly became extremely popular. I originally found it in writings about women's fashion and how fashion would lead to vanity or health problems, which would in turn commit race suicide. At the time, it seemed like an absolutely absurd leap to me. However, it's woven into that era far more deeply than I realized. President Theodore Roosevelt wrote about it, put it into his speeches, and formed policies around it. In 1905, speaking to the National Congress of Mothers, he emphasized the duty, quote, to bear and to bring up as they should be brought up, healthy children, sound in body, mind, and character, and numerous enough so that the race shall increase and not decrease. In 1916, The Passing of the Great Race was released by Madison Grant, a fictional pseudoscience history of the Nordic race, really just inventing a specific group and then spending an entire book trying to not only defend its specific existence, but why it's the best, and everyone else that does good things was just influenced by them. No other races actually came up with anything good ever, apparently. Some of the clearest examples of how every group was stereotyped with various bad, inherent behaviors can be found in this text. Its theories would go on to be important to both the Nazis and the KKK. Building on efforts like Roosevelt's to encourage population increases from particular groups, Grant also proposed sterilization of undesirables and elimination of defective infants. The concern wasn't that more Americans were dying than adding, but that specifically white, middle class, Christian women were not having enough children to stay as a pure majority. And they shamed them for it while seeking any way to slow the other population increases. Even in an era where the science of genetics was barely understood, or really because it wasn't difficult to drum up fear of a failing nation. If what they deemed to be clear superior traits were being lost in mixing races, like blonde hair and light eyes, what other aspects were also disappearing? Would Americans be more likely to drink and engage in vice, less hardy and have bad work ethics? Would illnesses run rampant amongst a weakened population? There was just enough information to provide a scientific basis to anyone with a theory and a loud voice. The true issue for those who feared white replacement, however, was why that birth rate was falling and how to fix it. In the 1880s and 90s, as France was dealing with those falling rates, others desperately tried to understand why that was happening to prevent it from spreading. This issue was especially concerning nationally as well, as at the time, France was deep into numerous military conflicts and saw fewer children as fewer future soldiers. The irony being that even then, plenty pointed out that the loss of men to death, illness, and poverty because of military time was the likely reason for the lower rate. Not everyone had this practical of an approach. Apparently, the Académie des Maisons believed that prostitution and syphilis were two of the most important factors in causing low birth rate. Marriages were happening later in life, so men were picking up things that would make them infertile later, and women were shortening their window for having children. The same could not be said for the changes here in the US, as our military was relatively small at the time, and social complexities quite different. Countless small reasons were put forward to explain it. Divorce was on the rise. Women were beginning to spend more and more time in the workplace, even factories, what potential health issues lurked there. Families were more likely to live in cities with poor sanitation and bad living space, or at least small enough living space that families didn't really fit. And women were just partying too much to want babies. Seriously, this 1896 article argues that childbearing, with all the self-sacrifices which this truly physiological condition imposes, is indeed not compatible with cotillions, euchre parties, and receptions. Therefore, it is said that women's vanity threatens the race. Men did not escape blame entirely, as drinking, smoking, and still syphilis were also listed as potential problems in fertility here. Effeminate men and masculine, or modern therefore promiscuous, women were also blamed in the early 20th century. I did a video on that further back if you're curious, but there were numerous trends that appeared because the youth was tired of the old systems which clearly were draining their parents and giving very little back, and wanted to try something different, especially right after World War I. Modern mindsets in general weathered the brunt of accusations. Young couples increasingly felt it was not sinful to make choices which limited the family numbers. The increase of fashionable goods being available meant their focus was on social pleasures and providing more for each child, rather than just more children. Marriage in general was also less sacred, leading to more single adults and waiting until later in life. Add in that further education was becoming increasingly popular. As people grow more educated and demand more of the comforts and even luxuries of life, they grow more prudent, and as one result, they marry later or even remain unmarried. Not everyone saw this progress and modernization as a terrible thing. Others argued with similar science that slower birth and growth rates were a sign of evolution. Better maternal care, better nourishment, and better qualified to survive. The result would be longer pregnancy, later puberty, and later marriage, which all leads to a decreased birth rate. Fortunately for the race. So, not necessarily with better long term intentions there. But overall, there wasn't a unified agreement on exactly what was causing the decision behind lower birth rates. However, every one of these lists found their way to the same practical conclusion. Women were medically preventing and ending pregnancy at alarming rates. State legislatures began banning birth control in the 1840s, but the Comstock Law of 1873 made it a federal ban. These early methods were a range of pills, powders, washes, and blockers. Condoms really took off in the mid century, however, as rubber became a viable option instead of things like animal intestines. Abortion followed the story of birth control and was banned in most states by 1880. Prior to that, the general belief was that pregnancy was an ailment until quickening happened, essentially until movement could be felt. Estimates from the mid to late 19th century show evidence that every 1 in 5 early pregnancies was dealt with in this way. One article from 1899 even claimed 90% of women had had an abortion at some point. Doubtful. The surgical removal of ovaries was also a relatively new option, for what reasons these articles always neglect to say, but they do like to note that around 500,000 women in France have had the procedure done, and these numbers must be just as bad in the US. The numbers were more like 100,000 worldwide in the entire 19th century, based on modern research. The reality of that is that it was a very difficult and deadly procedure that was done for varying extreme health issues, like postpartum depression. Not saying this was a good idea, but it was not generally done as a form of birth control and was even less commonly an elected procedure. A lot of women didn't even know it was happening, let alone volunteered themselves for that, with the understanding of the situation. But the needless sacrifice of a sinless ovary, as physician Thaddeus A. Remy put it in 1885, was just another sign of fertility danger. Other nations weren't having an easy time sorting the reasons behind fertility issues either. Germany had a high birth rate in the 1870s, up to 4% in 1879 compared to France at 2.6%. This overstretched education and employment, which was being blamed for an increase in poverty and other social issues. We all know where Germany went after that. But then again, the Netherlands also had high rates, but were considered prosperous and didn't have high immigration out of the country at the time. Sweden had low birth rates and high immigration. Basically, even based on information available at the time, birth rates didn't seem to be the cause of economic issues. Some did argue that it was the other way around, however. Thomas Malthus wrote in 1798 that he believed that as populations grew, we increasingly had to focus efforts on food production over other activities, and that there was a tipping point for that becoming a problem. Essentially, population growth is exponential, while food and resources are linear. Eventually, famine, war, or other catastrophes cause a reset of population. Neo-Malthusians built on this concept in the later 19th century to create a school of thought that supported and encouraged control of population growth, which included birth control, something Malthus did not support. In addition to concerns over human catastrophes, they also focused on the damage to the environment, which humanity was causing due to its spread. While Malthusianism is heavily criticized, and validly so, as it's not a predictable model given things like GMOs or other major adaptations which shift trajectories, it does seem to resurface both in situations of extreme population growth and subsequent poverty, as well as in times of slowing birth rates, as sort of the opposition to those panicking. The reality of why there was such a steep drop in the 19th century is fairly obvious to us now, though understandably complex. Though people may have had easier access to birth control methods compared to a generation or two past, they had to have a reason to want to use them. And while statistics show that women were having closer to 8 children in 1800, the statistics also show that the odds were against many of them living to adulthood. In the 1830s, close to 1/4 of all deaths were from children under the age of 1. That was generally true not only in the US, but across Europe as well. Childhood diseases were extremely common and could sweep through an entire family. It's estimated today that nearly half of all children died by age 5 in the early 19th century. By 1900, that was closer to 1/4. Still an incredibly high number, but statistically, if someone wanted 3 children to make it past that age in 1800, it would mean 6 live births, which is an unsure concept to begin with. In 1900, it would mean 4, which explains a large chunk of that shift even without any other social changes. If children are dying that young, it is not difficult to make the choice to have another child while still in the fertility window of adults' lives. The economy was not encouraging of larger families for most of the American population as the 19th century progressed. A long depression that lasted for around 25 years in the last quarter of the 19th century, leading straight into the Gilded Age of millionaires, a world war, another depression, and another world war. No wonder the birth rate didn't really rise again until the 1950s. While birth control and abortion was considered the direct enemy of birth rates, they don't follow each other nearly as much as you would expect. Yes, the pill in the 1960s does correspond with one of the largest drops, but there's also a rise after that from the 1980s to the 90s. Same thing with the drop in the 1930s, but rise in the 1950s. There were plenty of options available for birth control before the pill, and they weren't suddenly forgotten or made illegal in the 1950s. The social shifts towards women having their own careers, marrying later, and doing so for love rather than financial desperation were far more influential. But nothing really compares to the economy. Even today, articles will come up with some of the craziest reasons why we're seeing another drop in rates. One even blamed iPhones, which, notably, came out in 2007 and were slowly adopted. 2008 was when the recession officially hit, though there were signs and layoffs before that. While spending more time online than in person may have some long-term effects, especially in different cultures, the iPhone alone did not. What's truly crazy to me is how many articles acknowledge that the economy did have an effect, but that should have worn off when things got better in the 2010s, not remotely thinking about the entire generation that was going into parenting age, seeing how unstable and untrustworthy the economy could be. Of course, millennials were going to be hesitant. The economy got better for a very select group, not for most people, especially not for most younger people. And now Gen Z has had an entire childhood of watching that mess continue and affect their parents. Financial stability just isn't there. And based off of a lot of conversations that I've had with people ages 20 to 40, even if they are doing okay at the moment, They don't want to put a kid through another downturn, war, or social upheaval. It's not just, I would rather have nice things and spend money on myself. It's also, I don't want another child to experience what I have or what people I know did. And no amount of efforts to push traditional views will change that mindset. Free childcare, free healthcare, and parental leave. Maybe then. And everything that is happening currently is reflective of the same exact efforts that were made to curb low birth rate a century ago. They made abortion illegal, attempted to make as many forms of birth control illegal or difficult to access as possible, emphasized the religious and national importance of having a large family, and promised government relief or handouts to those that do. A lot of times that doesn't actually happen historically. And here's the biggest thing, it's not that dramatic of a fall. If you look at most of the charts online, it looks like a massive difference. They don't have the bottom line set as zero. It's always blowing up to make it look like we're swiftly headed towards the bottom, or they restrict it to just the last period of time where it fell. Most articles will say things like, birth rate has fallen 14% since 1960. You know, when things were still pretty much at their peak. If you look at annual percentage change instead, we're really close to zero compared to other points over the last 50 years. So why are we hearing about this panic now? It's not the first time and won't be the last that birth rates have fallen. But the children that are born are far more likely to make it past 5 than those from 200 or even 50 years ago. Supposedly, we're moving into a new world of technology where things will not only be more efficient and effective, but robots and AI will do our jobs for us. So why do we need so many new humans? Or is it that there's still some leftover concern of race suicide that has prompted the concern today? After all, just like before, birth rate panics seem to happen at the same time as immigration restrictions.